Good evening. On behalf of Orient Black Swan, I warmly welcome you to our discussion series event on the topic Rural Futures, which will present Dr. Mekhala Krishnamurthy in conversation with Professor Surinder S. Chotka. Let me briefly introduce the topic for this evening, Rural Futures. In popular urban and middle class imagination, as also in mainstream social science theories and the state's policy narrative, the end of the rural is often taken for granted. Modern and developed societies are presumed to be all urban, with a negligible proportion of their population living in rural settlements and practicing agriculture. Such a teleological narrative tends to infantilize the rural and privilege the urban educated elite. However, neither the village nor its agrarian economy and population has receded. In fact, the number of those living in India's villages in 2011 was nearly 3 times more than their numbers in 1951. But there has indeed been a significant decline in the influence of the village, and it is seen a persistent neglect by policymakers and the middle class elite of India. Despite being overlooked, the rural has continued to transform and evolve with the times. The village enables the city to prosper, and the city keeps the village going, albeit for its own sake. What could be the alternative ways of imagining rural futures? What questions do we need to ask about its pasts and presents? How do we visualize and frame spatiality in our understanding of the emerging worlds? Today's discussion will focus on some of these important issues, and we are fortunate to have with us this evening Professor Surinder S. Chotka and Dr. Mekhala Krishnamurthy. Dr. Mekhala Krishnamurthy is a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research and associate professor of sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University. Professor Surinder S. Chotka is professor of sociology at the School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Without further ado, let us open the floor to our panelists for the evening. Dr. Krishnamurthy and Professor Chotka, a very warm welcome to you. May I now request you to please commence today's discussion.
Thank you, Dibangana.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's great to be here and wonderful to be part of this conversation. And so thank you very much for organizing it to Orient Black Swan and to Professor Chotka for many conversations over the years on this. But I think it's really wonderful to have this opportunity to spend some time discussing with you rural futures. And as we were thinking about the title, it struck me that I started my fieldwork working on mandis in 2008. In 2007, I started this PhD. And at the time, it was interesting that the predominant discourse, as you sort of said in the framing of this, was about the decline of the rural, the disappearance of the rural, the withering away of agriculture. And I was, often reminded, even throughout this time of working on the Mandi, that people often say, that the misquoted Mark Twain quote, that the rumors of my demise or my death have been greatly exaggerated. And I feel like a lot of people in rural India would probably respond with exactly this to all of this discourse that has framed, I think, the end of the rural, both in terms of a teleological end that it's supposed to arrive, but also I think what has been even more surprising has been the number of times we have actually thought it is actually ending, right? And I'm thinking so many amongst us, and sociologists and anthropologists have continuously talked about people not wanting to do agriculture, the rural sort of, this withering, right? This language of the withering of culture and agriculture. And it struck me that this is a moment where the reality seems so starkly different, right? And we're emerging. I think there are 3 things that are so striking. Post-COVID, everybody was shocked that agriculture was the mainstay of the economy and where everything experienced such a huge destruction and debacle. Agriculture was the one sector of the economy that grew. Even prior to COVID, we know from the 2018-19 PLFS and other data that agriculture was the largest employer by a long distance. You're talking about over 70% of new jobs being actually created in rural India. Of those, 90% are in agriculture. So, the number of people still dependent on agriculture is it's not fallen short of 42, and it's now gone back up to 45. So that's at aggregate level. And then, last year, we saw this remarkable farmers protest, which brought agriculture and the question of agricultural markets and mandis and procurement absolutely to the center. And throughout COVID, we saw how, the PDS was a lifeline, agriculture. So, all of this has been happening. And it's really, I think, is worth asking what happened. Why did we keep thinking that Indian agriculture was disappearing over the last 20 years? That the rural was disappearing over the last 20 years. And what we've seen is, you could call it resilience, but to me, it almost seems common sense to anybody who's been doing field work. That this is the reality that we have. So I thought we can begin here, sort of just looking at the puzzle of how come we keep predicting this, demise, and how come it doesn't come.
Thank you very much, Meghla. Thank you, OBS, for organizing this discussion. We've been thinking about it for some time. And as Meghla said, on this topic, we have also been having lots of conversations. And in some sense, rest of the world is also having conversations on this kind of topic. So as I think you rightly pointed out, there are different moments when we begin to think about rural and agriculture in a particular manner. And that in some sense, even when gets revised for some time and then it comes back. So I personally feel that this is one of the foundational questions of what one could broadly describe as modernity, particularly modernity of post-colonial kind of societies, which in some sense had already been captured in a very kind of, ideological manner by the post-enlightenment, Eurocentric narratives of the world. And I think one must kind of historically situate them. Even the idea of rural and its other urban is constructed post-19th century in a specific manner, where the two are presented as binaries, and binaries which are also at some level then framed in this, what we use the word teleological kind of narratives, where the future of rural is urban, like the future of child is an adult. So it's not something that rural has choice of. It's just a matter of how quickly you grow up and how early you kind of, become an adult. So I think, and that also in some sense, obviously privileges countries of the West, which have had a particular trajectory of urbanization. It's not only, interestingly, if you look at the global urban population and global rural population, it's a very interesting kind of data that we don't ever talk about. Yes, urban population today in the world is more than what it ever was. I mean, it's perhaps more than 50%. But this shift, which even in this kind of binary demographics, happens as recently as 2007-8. And even today, the number of rural people living in rural areas, the way they are demographically constructed by different state formations, happens to be higher than ever before. Absolute number of rural population has not declined globally. So it has declined in certain countries of Western Europe, and that also because of its own historical trajectory post 18th, 19th century. And that narrative in some sense then gets institutionalized in our own imaginations of the world through university system, through textbooks, through the way, in a sense, academia is structured. And it, in some sense, is very useful for us. I mean, at some level, middle class elite finds it very privileging, because then they are the ones who are custodians of change. They are the ones what is good for the ruler. and it gives them that kind of, position of privilege. So I think this is a framing illusion of the modern times, not only of last 5 years, 10 years, even, for example, look at the early development narratives, even the idea of rural development. When rural development is framed by UN agencies, or before that, in some sense, in planning commission documents in some form or the other, nobody talks about urban development. So urban is taken for granted. Urban is already developed. Like you never hear about the countries of West as having been developing countries ever. They are assumed to have always been developed, and they're assumed to have kind of been born developed. So I think this is where the trap lies. Uday, you are not muted. Uday Rao? Yeah, sorry, thank you. So I think the point that you made about how in recent past we have had very interesting kind of events. I mean, COVID was a tragic event, and people going back to their villages was even more tragic. And at some level, farmers' movement also was a very, very painful moment for farmers themselves, even though they kind of celebrated their victories. And, if you went to border, they looked very cheerful. And it was also a kind of very interesting moment for Indian democracy. But at the same time, lots of people died, and they had to kind of prove their point. And I think one of the points that farmers were making, that you're not talking to villagers, you're talking to citizens. And again, they were saying that we know what is good for us. We know what policy is. And they were speaking smartly, and they were speaking perhaps most of the time far more clearly and sharply than the policymakers were doing. And the middle classes, urban middle classes, were either indifferent, or they kind of, patronizingly sympathized with them. There were many who also kind of, celebrated it. I'm not saying that everyone is similar, but yes, it in some sense does both the things. At one level, it in some sense shows you the realities of rural being still around and still thriving and surviving. But at the same time, even the narrative around, or even the visuals around people going back to their villages very clearly showed that village is a hopeless place, even though this is the place where people want to die, but this is not the place where people want to live. They want to live. If they have to live, they have to come to the city. But that also at some level opens up many other questions. And this is precisely why we need to talk about rural futures. And rural futures then becomes a very important kind of question, where we not only have to talk empirically, because empirical can also be very momentary, as you rightly pointed out. Empirical also has to be at some level theoretically and critically imagined. And that's where perhaps we can kind of take this discussion forward. If we have to think about rural futures, we perhaps also need to invent new language through which to talk about settlements.
No, so I was just thinking two different things that we could maybe discuss a little more in detail. So the first is that I think when you think about the past, and you and I have talked about this a lot, but also, I mean, I have done this fieldwork in mandis, and it was very interesting that the mandi town, or the small town, was for a very long time a missing sociological site, right? Anything on small towns would begin with how you're either on your way to the city or the village. And it was the route that you would take, and basically you would bypass. You would just use it as a transit point, right? Nobody actually thought stuff was going on in that town. But that's completely untrue. If you look at historically, small towns have been vibrant nodes of trade. But also we know that the hooking together of the rural and the agrarian, whether in a census category or in popular imagination or in our sort of academic scholarship, the richness has always been quite different. So the rural has always been more than agriculture, and we know this. Historically, whether it's looking at service communities, whether it's looking at statecraft and the running of the state, whether it's looking at different kinds of bureaucratic forms, but also trade. You always had these kinds of other workers and people, not which is just labor, but we had artisans, craftsmen, so there was a village economy beyond agriculture, while agriculture has always been central. And then we have, and the market has been there long before we started taking it seriously in sociology as something that is not new and has recently penetrated. But equally, agriculture has always been more than rural. And both of us are sitting today in Delhi, which is a hugely agrarian city. And if you go to Azadpur, but also to many of the other markets across this city, it is virtually impossible not to think of Delhi as agrarian, right? But equally, Patna over years, and Anand Yang's work, or the many cities in South India, right? Like these are deeply um, agrarian spaces. The fact that all of us know what seasonal vegetables are, the seasons change, the vegetables change, what comes in. This is, the other day a conversation, are mangoes still coming? Are they, all that tells you that if you are consuming food, as all of us do, you're part of an agrarian system. So I think in some ways also the failure to see, and so, today we talk about urban agriculture as almost like a fad or a fashion, vertical agriculture, but in a different sense, agriculture has always been there in the cities, right? And so I think both of those, if we look historically, do some of the work that you were saying, which is to problematize this idea that the rural, and at most we go to agriculture and allied. So we talk about livestock and we talk about all of this, and we talk about the fact that rural people earn so much from non-farm as some kind of strange thing. So, I mean, I find it really amazing when people say, oh God, so many people are moving out of agriculture or don't want to be in agriculture. And if you actually talk to people, or if you look historically at families, if you do well in agriculture, you tend to move out of agriculture. And if you do badly in agriculture, you tend to move out of agriculture. Diversification of that natural kind has always been a historical reality. And so both distress and surplus produce a certain kind of dynamism and movement that connects the agrarian and the non-agrarian, and the agrarian and the urban, and the rural and the urban. And I mean, now it's so tiring that we talk about rural-urban linkages. We've talked about this for years in development policy. But I think the lived reality of these settlements and their reshaping seems to have been completely missed in the way we speak about agriculture as if its temporality is one, like exactly as you say, like a primitive state of development after which people will move. But the truth is agriculture is tied to food, and human beings eat, and that's what we do. And then secondly, it's tied to all of these different kinds of livelihoods. And again, what there is a failure in terms of the quality of jobs, and there is a failure in terms of the kind of livelihood that most Indians are able to access. But we were doing fieldwork in Odisha just before again COVID and the lockdown, and so many small surplus producing small and marginal farmers were also laborers. And if you ask them why they didn't give up their land, it was a very simple answer. A year before they actually walked back home, they said, when the city shuts, we will have a place to grow food and we will go back home. And this was a year before. And they could have said this to you 2 years or 10 years before. There is always the sense that there is a need for certain kinds of social security. And you could look at that as the failure of Indian policy to provide good jobs where people feel that they can give up half an acre or 1 acre of land. But on the other hand, it's a more complicated reality because people might still not, and we don't know, right? So I think this is one piece I wanted, and then there's another which is actually on the problem. But I thought I'll just hear you on this first, because to me, this seems to be, again, an astonishingly obvious thing, right? When you frame the agrarian in this way. And I think, David Ludden has often said, historically, urbanization in India happened within agriculture. So again, to assume that, irrigation bureaucracies, state formation, we know that it's all tied to this huge task of cultivating the land, growing the land, domesticating production. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this kind of has at least half a dozen different questions or lines of discussion where we can kind of spend hours to discuss. I think the point I will begin with is this idea of Mandi town. Again, I mean, if you have to look at an alternative narrative of rural and urban, that's where it is. For example, every culture would have its own language for settlements. So
Yes.
we think of, West being urban and India being rural, and that has been the narrative popular with planners and theoreticians and social scientists ever since social sciences took off in India with development studies. But the actual reality is that India has had a variety of settlements. I mean, even when you go to, say, for example, hilly areas, they will have separate term for rural settlements. Smaller settlements would be called different. Larger settlement would have a different name: gaon, kasbah, shahar. Otherwise, also, for urban settlements, you'll have a variety of different names. So at ground level, even today, if you speak to a demographer who actually do work or in field, they would say there are census towns, there are statutory towns, and then the way administrative structures are formed, they are responding to the ground realities that they are encountering. So in some sense, they are much more authentic than the narratives that we teach in classroom. So at another level, even kind of when we think about cities, you were talking about Delhi as being an agrarian city and Patna as being agrarian city. I would also think of, villages of Dwapa in Punjab, or in kind of, small settlements near Pune would be urban villages at some level, not only, urban villages in Delhi. But coming back to Delhi, I mean, if you have to think about Delhi, Hauz Khas is both a village and a city, right? So there are two Hauz Khases. And leave aside Delhi, I mean, you as I give this example to my students in classroom very often, that you move out of the north gate of JNU, you see a village called Munirka. But now Munirka itself is divided into 4 or 5 different kinds of settlements. There are Munirka DDA flats, then there is Munirka village, then there is Munirka enclave, and in between there is also another set of Munirka enclave, a Munirka kind of flats, and then you have a huge market around Munirka. These are very different kinds of urban realities at some level. Munirka village is at some level is rural in administrative sense, urban villages, but there are landlords there which are very different kind of landlords, and these are urban slums which supports migrant workers or students who are graduated from university and they don't have a job yet and they want to find a house for 2,000 rupees per month and they get a small room there. So I think the economy and political economy of settlements, even within a small place like JNU or kind of Munirka village, would be of 4 or 5 different types. Now, with the language that we have, doesn't allow us to even identify those differences. And these are not simply kind of questions of academic interest. These have policy implications. These have administrative implications. And the way people are living in those tiny apartments, they don't become because there is something called Lal Dora. Within Lal Dora, you can construct the way you wish to. So you're not accessible to policy. And even when you're accessible to policy, so there are kind of specific interests that would push the policy in a particular manner, but there is no language or there's no kind of engagement. And this is not unique to North Gate of JNU. Wherever you go in Delhi, Vasant Vihar is a huge kind of very elite place, but there is also Vasant Vihar slum. And Vasant Vihar slum is a place where we don't even know how many people live and what kind of houses they have, how many kind of children are living there and how many old people are living there and what kind of issues do they have. And I think agriculture and I think you framed it very differently. We kind of equate rural with agrarian. And even when we say that there is something called non-farm economy, we then say that non-farm economy begins in the 90s. Yes, there is at some level non-farm economy that begins in the 90s or takes off in the 90s. But artisan economy has always been there. And we somehow say people were dependent on agriculture directly or indirectly. Not true, right? Potters were making pots for everyone, right? Leather workers were making shoes for everyone. They were not making only for villagers. And India has always had a very large urban population. I'm using the word large. During colonial period, actually there was a ruralization. Yeah. And if you look at the total urban population of India in the early 18th century, is much larger than the total population of Great Britain. I'm talking about the urban population of India in early 18th century is much larger than the total population of Great Britain. And they come here, then we become land of village republics and they become urban civilization. So these are narratives. What are they doing even before Britishers? When the Arab traders are trading in you were talking about agriculture being urban, what were they trading in? They were trading in spices. No, spices are not manufactured in factories in urban areas with artificial intelligence, these are agricultural products. So when they come to India, all these traders from different parts of the world, leave aside India, China, which was very vibrant kind of trade route, and economic historians have plenty of literature on that. And that somehow does not become the resource for theorizing our processes of change, right? So artisan economy was not simply non-agrarian economy, it was also a technological economy, right? So when you have IITs coming from outside, local technological cultures are then degraded in this caste narratives as being low status. And with that is linked this whole idea of moving out of agriculture. Moving out of agriculture is also the way middle class structures its aspiration post 90s. Post 90s, young people who are growing up in rural areas all over the country. I was also doing field work in around 2008 and revisiting my villages in Haryana after 20 years of my first field work. Young people didn't want to stay in the village, and you know, once you're educated, then education is seen as moving out, and that is also seen as the normative for mobility. But these normatives for mobility have become institutionalized only recently. They have not been there always. Like you were talking about, people could go back, but this is not something that happens post pandemic. It also happens in the 19th century, when we know that, you know, Britishers came and they destroyed local industry, local artisan economy, and people went to rural areas because they had rural contacts. Even when their jobs are lost in the city, where do they go? So these kind of, you know, in common popular imaginations on ground, these are choices. These are not inevitabilities that you have to move in one particular direction. Agriculture can come back. Agriculture is not something which goes away anywhere. But the point is that we are at some level also hegemonized by the economists, and economists somehow work with those models, and those models have their own limitations because they are grounded in a particular experience of change, and which is very Eurocentric and actually Western experience of change. So how do we think about our own experience of change, which is kind of independent of, not that it has to be independent. I mean, there are no discrete regions, there are no discrete economies any longer. So we are all connected. And that's why, in some sense, you know, things are so difficult as they are. So I think, you know, agriculture and industries are another binary. But how many people work in industry and how many people work in agriculture? There are so many other economies. And the so-called service sector is not something that emerges in the 20th century. Service sector has always been there. Right? There was in India, there was, you know, all kinds of realities which we fail to recognize, or which we refuse to recognize because it doesn't suit us, or it is not there in textbooks of economics and sociology.
You know, two things that you said which are so interesting, and somebody has asked this question, you know, rural is heterogeneous, how do you deal with it? So the question that comes to me when you ask a question like that is exactly, you know, who wants to deal with it, right? So one is, how do you deal with it as a policy problem or a policy challenge, which is exactly what you said, the administrative language of the census, but also rural development is separate, urban development is separate. Urban does get constituted as a problem at a certain point, precisely because of slums. And we then have this population thinking, right? That you want to keep the rural population in rural areas. We have not seen migration, as in even with NREJ, there was a very strong framing of how to keep people in rural areas, right? Rather than understand that people have always moved and they can move between the urban and the rural too. So there were certain, I think, explicit and implicit problematizations in policy that decide that, you know, this is what rural development should look like. And interestingly, rural development is very rarely talked about in terms of economy. So it is usually talked about in terms of livelihood. And livelihood has a very funny and tenuous relationship with sort of this idea of, you know, subsistence and maybe a little bit of surplus. But we, you know, when we think about rural jobs or rural employment, and NREJ is a rural employment guarantee scheme, in India, we typically have thought of, you know, it's the National Rural Livelihood Mission. And you're not clear, are livelihoods part of an economy? Farmer producer organizations, cooperatives, are they firms? You know, do we look at them as commercial institutions at all? Or do we take this? And I think you talked about economists. I think a major challenge, at least that I've seen, certainly in trying to study markets, is that we had separated agricultural production, agricultural exchange, then distribution and consumption, as if these are all different features, right? So we had people studying rural consumption and food patterns, and we have people studying agricultural production, where the bulk of economic literature came out in the 60s, 70s, 80s, which is very much thinking about agricultural production systems. But markets and exchange then come in as if they are something new, as if agricultural production, exchange, marketing, distribution and consumption are not part of a common system. Whereas if you study agricultural credit, as you have done, you know that like farmers take credit in the season of cultivation, which they repay in the season of commodity marketing. And you cannot study agricultural markets and mandis without studying agricultural production and credit relations and all this temporal movement that happens in money. So I think somewhere by not looking at things empirically, we mislabeled things, and then we created administrative silos for those things: a rural development department, a livelihood mission, a marketing board, a cooperatives department, fisheries. We don't actually see the way in which a common household is usually doing a whole range of farm, non-farm, teaching, other things. They're also teachers, they're health workers, they also farm, they do all of these different kinds of jobs and roles and non-economic roles too. So, to me, a big problem is that, yeah, for policy, of course, at some point you have to make things into schemes and programs and departments. But when that logic takes over how you actually understand people's, things, which is why I actually now feel for Indian policy, agriculture is a welfare subject. It is not a vibrant part of economic life. And it is actually seen as a SOP, a drag, a welfare problem, a subsidy problem. It is not seen as a vibrant and essential economic sector. And that's hugely, debilitates your imagination. Not to make everything marketized and corporatized, but even to understand the nature of commercial life. So I think that policy problem of the framing, and the same with migration, right? This idea that you have to stop rural people from migrating, that migration now has to be framed as a problem. In the post-COVID moment, migration has become a problem, as if it's not just a human process, people move. So how do we re-look at some of these? Yes, we need to eventually schematize and administer and run, and there's governance. But how the imagination then, I think, gets shaped by the administrative problematization, I think has been a huge problem for, thinking about the rural really as a drag now, and agriculture effectively. Which was very different from a country like ours, where you actually need agriculture to grow for the rest of the economy to grow. And you cannot produce multipliers in any other sector quite as effectively as you can in agriculture. So that, I think, is another.
No, I think it's a very interesting kind of biography of the rural and agrarian, which in some sense, say, if you look at the narrative of 1950s and 60s, up to 1970s and 80s at some level, where agriculture is seen as a productive kind of site where you have introduction of new technology, green revolution and stuff like that. And the Marxists would also say that surplus from agriculture could also in some sense support industrialization and modernization of the economy. And to this thing about agriculture becoming a drag post-90s, where at some level, not only the service sector in India takes over when the growth expands, but it is also the growing hegemony of the corporate economy and urban middle classes, because the urban middle classes that grow post-90s, they grow in private sector and they become very hegemonic, even though many of them have come from villages, but they think that they are the ones who are India, as some sociologists have argued. They don't even see others. Others have to be supported. And that's where the way rural development is conceptualized actually by UN agencies, not by Government of India, but then everyone accepts those agencies. So those narratives, at some right from the beginning, the way rural development is conceptualized is that poor people live in villages and poor people have to be provided livelihoods. Yes, they're all poor. So that is where I think the other question that you were talking about, heterogeneity of the rural. So heterogeneity of the rural is not recognized, right? Somehow at some level, either you have a flat imagination of the rural being poor, being illiterate, being primitive, being agrarian, being unreasonable and unrational. On the other hand, you have rural as being, having some landlords, like we saw recently when farmers movement came up, that these are rich farmers of Punjab and Haryana, and they take away all the surplus, and they are real poor farmers in other states of the country. So there are farmers and there are workers everywhere. Caste question is very central to rural life. Heterogeneities are not only urban, heterogeneities are also rural. And that hasn't changed much. I mean, all of us who have been going back to villages, yes, people are mobile, but some people are moving out, some people stay back. But the reality of caste continues to persist very, very strongly in rural areas. Occupations have disappeared. I mean, all those occupations which were identified with certain caste groups don't exist any longer. Even if they exist, they're not more than 1 or 2 or 3 households from that caste community who would be performing that occupation. But that's nothing new. Even in kind of 18th century, that was not the case. I mean, we have this very simplistic sociological understanding of caste as occupation, which again has the same kind of roots in conceptualization. And I think that's where this whole question of urban as problem and rural as at some level poor, and poor would want to come to the city, and middle class city will get polluted because there would be more population living here. So I think this whole thing, if you look at this imagination, it is imagination of the urban middle class, which at some level wants to claim exclusive ownership over this country. And I think that is a political problem. It's not simply a question of academics. Even when people know they want to kind of exclusively claim that they are the ones who are India, and because they are the ones who are India, no one else has agency. Lots of people were very uncomfortable when farmers wanted to articulate what is good for agriculture. Who the hell are they to know what is good for agriculture? First time when they came from Punjab to have engagement with the government representatives, they were told, like, okay, you don't understand. We have this version translated in Punjabi for you. And these are farmers who are talking in English, right? And most likely they would be more educated than some of the people who are representing government of India, and they are speaking in English language. That we know English language. I have a degree. I can understand your language. And they would say, nahi, sahab, you go and read this in Punjabi. You would understand how good the farm laws are for you, right? And this actually happened, and that's why farmers were so kind of disturbed, and they left. So I think there is this whole narrative of you using the word reason. And I think that's very, very important, because reason is seen as an urban middle class, educated in a Western kind of medium in English language. They are the only who can reason. So I think that's where question of empirical is very critical. But empirical can also be conveniently, all economists would say they are empirical, right? But what categories do you use in order to do empirical work? And I think that's where political questions also become social science questions. So not that those who claim to be doing very clear empirical work, they are not political. They already have those categories, which takes demise of rural for granted, which divides the settlements into 2 binaries. So I think there is political already embedded in these categories and classifications. And those categories and classifications are political because they at some level make urban middle class educated, Western educated. They're not even middle class. They're also at some level elite, who then want to claim that they are the ones who would speak for India because India is their country, and others are dependent on them. They might be 70%, they might be 95%. It doesn't really matter. But certainly the 70% ruralites need to be at some level governed. And that's where poor has always been governed. And that's the struggle. I mean, the farmers were saying that we are citizens. We have.
But I think what you're saying is so important, right? They're political theorists. I mean, the farmers also, at least the ones that the farmers movement from Punjab, also cited the constitution. And they had read, so their ability to understand federalism and understand whether something is a state subject, which agricultural markets have, been and are constitutionally, they were literally the only ones. I mean, one of the great puzzles of the farmers' agitation and the farm laws was even state governments stayed away from the constitutionality. Farmers were the people who raised the constitutional question. And it was convenient for everybody else, including, the governments they did other things, but they didn't say this is our constitutional duty, partly because they know they have also failed farmers in those constitutional duties. States have, of course, failed their farmers, just as we as a country have done, things in policy that have been woefully insufficient. So I think what you're pointing out, though, one is that they're political theorists and citizens. I think equally and really important, I've often wondered this word, we don't want to use citizen. We also are nervous to use, although we talk about the rural voter, we don't quite give them citizenship, we give them voting. And this is a classic sort of thing. But the other thing, we don't really use the word entrepreneurship. So it's very interesting that the idea of enterprise generation, income generation, actually comes with microfinance and micro enterprise in this, suddenly we saw again in the 2000s, huge number of microfinance programs, SHGs. This was all for labor. Interestingly, most of them, it was targeted at women labor, right? The poorest, so small and marginal farmers and laborers. In fact, often if you work with farmers, they'll tell you SHGs are not for us because they are for rural labor. But the idea was that small amounts of capital or cash or income would become income generators. And of course, a lot of the research on microfinance has shown that it was used for consumption smoothing. It was not used for income generation. And a lot of those people wanted jobs. And again, NREGA shows you that there's so much demand in rural India for 100 days of employment, and most states cannot provide 100 days of employment, and demand usually exceeds actual supply of jobs. And yet we refuse to use on enterprise to talk about millers or small traders or firms. At best, we call them intermediaries or middlemen. We will refuse to use, although they run businesses that actually manage a huge amount of risk. They are agro-commercial capitalists. Of course, they evade tax. Of course, they do all kinds of malpractice. We don't need to, you can understand that, of course.
Corporates.
But so do all businesses in India. So why? But we can talk about business and enterprise, right? And the other thing that was very striking in 2007-8 when I started fieldwork was that on the one hand, the narrative of rural decline and rural disappearance. On the other hand, there was already talk, and now that the farm laws were in some senses an expression of that, of a corporate-led rural transformation, that the second green revolution was going to be led by corporate sector. And even the farm laws, which kept talking about private, assume a certain kind of private sector, a large-scale organized private sector that is supposed to come and overrun rural India and turn it into something that is productive and efficient and, really bustling and thriving, right? Now, I find this really interesting because also rural people have bought in slightly to the story. So I remember in 2004, 5, 6, 7, when ITC was coming into rural Madhya Pradesh, Mandi traders all went on strike and they said East India Company is coming back and we will be dead. And I reminded them of the same, the rumors of my demise are greatly exaggerated because I said, hey, you're still here. You haven't disappeared. The Mandi hasn't disappeared. You said they would come and take over. Now, one of the most interesting things of this 15 years is also that after repeated efforts to get the corporate sector into rural India, and the corporate sector is also very old in rural India, right? I mean, we have had FMCG companies there for a very long time. We've had tobacco and other plantation crops for a very long time. We've had large scale, state capital, right? The cotton corporation, the commodity boards for a long time. So it's not like we've had no organized rural agro-commercial sector, but it's another puzzle that for years, so Bihar took off its APMC Act. Apparently, APMCs were keeping corporates out. After 15 years, 17 years, we find corporates are not at the farm gate. They are buying in, Gulab Bagh. They are definitely there in the markets, but they're not there where we expected them to, right? And they didn't take over. And to me, this is the other puzzle, is that how come for such a long time we refuse to recognize entrepreneurship in rural India in terms of agro-commercial entrepreneurship, regional capital? We refuse. So at most, they are called MSMEs, but nobody actually treats them even as MSMEs, as so traders associations and all are intermediary interests, they're professional bodies and they're commercial bodies, but they're not given any, we don't assume that, and so many times, and we've seen it in Punjab, that it's farmers who are also artyas, they're also running firms, they're also retailing. So it's not as if, people with surplus will not expand, right, and do small businesses. But that dignity of, small business as an acceptable language. And the United States had it for a very long time. Of course, it's now completely commercialized agriculture. But I almost feel like India has a window where if our imagination would let us see risk-bearing capacity as genuine enterprise capabilities, rural India is very entrepreneurial in different ways. We have never given public investment where it's deserved. We have never built public infrastructure where it's deserved. We have never really reached, institutional support. So Amul and all of these remain these, success stories that we talk about in very big isolation. But to me, what's interesting about that early phase was that the builders of that cooperative saw this as commercial and political and social and citizenship, right? That they did see it as a different economy and a different politics. But I think we as a country stay away from that. So we actually have an image of corporate-led agriculture in a country which has the possibility of having a very different model. And I don't know why that has happened.
No, absolutely. I think these are wonderful points that you have made, and all of them at some level are so critical and so real in the sense that they are not simply academic questions. They are questions of our history, they are questions of our options, they are questions of our reality, they are questions of our future in actually everyday life and our possible futures. And I think unless we engage, I think the question of entrepreneurship is very, very critical. And that's where this language of future being monopoly of urban is a political game, right? It's not something which is happening innocently. You were talking about millers. I would also talk about cobblers. I would also talk about potters. I mean, there's so much happening in pottery. We urban class kids now go and learn pottery, and then they become entrepreneurs, sell those kind of small items they make. But pottery can be, really these are things that were completely delegitimized. Even our imagination began to see themselves as low status occupations, and therefore you stigmatize them, and those artisans who are at some level globally celebrated, but at the same time there's no recognition of them as potential value generators. They are only seen as, again, as possible activities which could give them livelihoods. So they're not seen as value generators which can add to national income. Another person we can add to it is tractor driving farmer. Tractor driving farmer is not a primitive agriculturist. She or he is, there are also women who drive tractors in Punjab and perhaps elsewhere also, who can be actually as urban, and they have been urban. I think if we go back to Daniel Thorner's early conceptualization of a capitalist farmer, the word that he used was gentleman farmer. And gentleman farmer was an enterprising farmer. Gentleman farmer was not simply a kind of the way later mode of production debate kind of again stigmatized them as capitalist farmer who exploits, who has surplus, who accumulates. Yes, that was also there. And that is, I think, related to the point that you made about, given that 70% of India votes from villages and still villages are ignored. I think this is a puzzle. How do we explain this? That voters are from rural areas. I mean, they all manipulated, they are fooled by politicians. No, I think there is also a kind of the point that we were talking about heterogeneity of the rural becomes very critical. Who speaks for the village? Who represents village? And how are they represented? Those narratives also then kind of, at some level, take away that agency from the rural. To visualize rural to have a singular agency is fundamentally flawed. So rural is internally very diverse, and the rural is always connected with rest of the economy in a variety of different ways, right? So rural Dalits and variety of Dalits will have different kind of, in some sense, economic relationships, social and political ties with rest of the country in very different ways from, say, the so-called dominant caste, so the so-called upper caste living in villages would have. So I think that's where the problem lies. Even framing this question that village has 70% voters, then why do politicians ignore it? That needs to be revisited. So there is rural voter at some level, but rural voter is also a Dalit voter. Rural voter is also a Maratha voter. Rural voter is also a Maratha women voter. Rural voter is also a kind of Brahmin voter who lives in villages, or Baniya voter. So there are different ways in which one needs to disaggregate the rural in order to engage with ground realities of these spatial formations, which are at some level nationally structured, but now increasingly also globally connected, right? When Dalit protests happen in villages of Punjab, they are not confined to villages of Punjab. They immediately connect themselves to Birmingham and Vancouver. And these are active processes which are happening at a given time. These are not like, messages will go and they will send funding. This is how they consult each other with social media. And I think that needs to be reimagined. The rural needs to be also globally reimagined as a cosmopolitan center. And that cosmopolitanism is not confined only to these kind of diasporic Dalits of Punjab. That is all across. Even poor tribal peasants would also have some connections with outside world, and they are framed by outside world. And this is where I think rural development, the framing of rural development, plays a very hegemonic role, which takes away all these possibilities of conceptualizing rural differently. So you talk about entrepreneurs, you talk about deprivations. Deprivations are not aggregated deprivation. Deprivations are specific. There are privileged people living in rural areas, and their questions are different. But they may also have political questions, like farmers' movement leaders. They were not poor. That's how they were able to sustain the movement. If they were actually poor farmers, as we expect them to be, they would not last for more than 2 days or 3 days, or at the most 1 week or 1 month. They were able to sustain because they were resourceful. And their being resourceful is not a crime. Everyone else is also resourceful, and they have their requirements.
But it was framed exactly. But it was framed exactly as a crime, right? It was a surplus producing farm.
One more point that you made is very critical, and I would like to comment on it. You talk about corporate takeover of agriculture and private, and then agriculture has always been private, right? There is no public sector agriculture. We did not have Soviet-style collectivization of agriculture. Even during the so-called Nehruvian socialist period, agriculture was completely private. And when Green Revolution was introduced, the technology, the vision did not come from Soviet Union. It came from United States. And it was at some level, some people would say imposed, but it was to produce an enterprising farmer. And they were enterprising, and they thought that this would increase their profit. And now they're realizing that this also killing them. So I think this whole idea of private and corporate coming from outside needs to be revisited. That agriculture itself has, in Punjab, we have, for example, tomato kings and potato kings, and they have been producing Pepsi and other kind of corporates for a long time, and they're not recognized. They're not given that space that you kind of participate in the whole process of kind of, taking it forward, even if you were to kind of, take it forward through that same imagination, but you kind of think of agriculture as a singular monolith, and then you think that same kind of policy should be introduced.
But I think just to this last point that you made, and I think these are small but important distinctions, right? The Green Revolution, interestingly, it produced what were enterprising farmers, but they were supposed to be good farmers in that they adopted the package, right? And then they produced for the state. But of course, they were being entrepreneurs, because that is precisely in the post-Green Revolution period in
Punjab, but also in Western UP and Haryana, you see a mixed economy emerge. You see people start investing surplus. We know, Sharad Chari's work and other work in Tirupur is that Tirupur was founded on Gounder capital. Right, it was founded, and Harish has studied the whole story in South India, but it is actually agrarian surplus and agrarian toil that goes into the creation of an industrial cluster like Tirupur. And so it's a Gounder surplus, right? So here in Punjab, you see, and then of course people migrate and they do all kinds of other things because they're responding also to what the state produces and gives them as opportunity. We see this happening in all the work in Western UP where people actually invested in education. In Madhya Pradesh, when after the Tawa Canal, for the first 10 years, farmers invested in improving agriculture. They expanded production, but over time they started settling in the town, right? And they used to say that Hadda used to be a village of townsmen. The town itself was small, but it had all the townspeople, and it has now become a town of villagers as people have started moving and studying in the cities, moving out, coming back. Often they have two families, one takes care of the farm, the other, all the children of the family stay in the village, in the city or the town, and then they study, and then some of them go on further to do higher studies. So all of this is happening, and it is all on the back of, and people are responding. And yet we don't think, again, this is the constitution of the problem. These are people from whom development policy has very little to say because they're not seen as either in poverty, they're not subjects to be developed, right? And if they're entrepreneurial, we often think about them still in that landlord or dominant caste mindset. And I'm not saying caste doesn't have a big role to play here in networks. It does. In the town of Hadda, all the Jats had all the dealerships and the pumps, and the Gujars had the medical shop. So, of course, caste is very important here, but it functions differently, right? It functions more as a network, and it's doing other kinds of work than what we always imagined it would be doing. And I think this understanding of this group of people, of mobility, that people are, again, is something we study. And again, the regional trajectories, I think, have got missed. Punjab had a very different story. And I think even the public system in Punjab, it's interesting with AAP's return. There's a return to talking about the public system, but the public system in Punjab used to be very strong at a certain point in time. Other states have going through their transitions now. So in a sense, even the standard structural transformation model that we had, India is going to have many different kinds of regional changes and shifts, very different engagements, both within the country and, with other countries. And the border regions will have a different story. And, there are all kinds of relationships, as you said, in Punjab and Canada, the different sorts of relationships that are emerging, or the Gulf and the South. So, all of that. So I think, again, our understanding of regional change, of regional structural transformation, how different states are doing and have done, needs to get much better. And I think that's a big agenda for future work. Again, we do not talk about this. We just talk about share of the economy in urban and rural, or how much of a thing is urban or rural. But these dynamics, I think, again, are constantly missed out.
We already have evidence of this kind of diverse trajectories.
Yeah.
If you're willing to open up the question of transformation, you again have a particular narrative of transformation. Look at the trajectories of state like Gujarat or Tamil Nadu or Andhra Pradesh. You were talking about, say Reddys and Kammas, how they generated their surplus in agriculture, and then now they control the entire real estate economy of Hyderabad, or in Tamil Nadu, the case of local communities from rural areas, or what Bal Gopal described as provincial propertied class diversifying itself into urban. It's happening in Punjab and Haryana as well, but their commitment to agriculture is very different. These are cultural factors, historical factors, various other possibilities, and kind of entrepreneurship becomes very, very critical there. That's where question of initiative and leadership becomes very critical. What kind of areas are you willing to diversify into? How would you organize and mobilize your resources, both economic but also muscular and political resources, which would help you in some sense, go into a particular kind of urban agrarian or non-agrarian economy, that would in some sense also, because you have political power and the Damodaran's work that you were referring to, these are very interesting kind of empirical processes. And I think the point that you made in earlier kind of intervention is that India provides a window to reimagine the world at this moment. And for that, we need to engage with the rural. These were perhaps, I thought I'll give us closing comments. We can come back to it. But I think we are already 1 hour into discussion. And if you want to take some question of the audience or whatever is the format, we can go to Nilanjana and she can perhaps help us.
But I think coming back to this just before, what you were about to say about how does one then look at what India can offer, first and foremost to ourselves, right? I think there has to be an ambition here in how we speak about the rural and urban. And so, in some senses, Devangana and OBS, right? What if we called it it's Indian futures? Indian futures will largely be rural, right? But had we called this Indian futures, would we have started with agriculture? Right? That is the question I have, which is why wouldn't we have? Right? And if you had called it Indian futures, maybe we would have talked about urban youth and IT, because that is where we begin when we think about India's future. But you had to put rural futures for us to start with agriculture and rural development and villages and towns. But to me, if we talk about Indian futures, it will necessarily involve, to a very large extent, large parts of rural India and agriculture. The fact that we don't do that tells me that we don't engage with our own realities, right? Of course, IT will be a big part of that story too, because IT is a big part of India. Technology will be a big part because science has always been a big part of India. So, there is a language would and politics would, and, the social contracts that we forge with our states, because state building has been an old part of India. So to me, it is always interesting that we have to start with saying rural futures and agricultural futures and destiny to talk about the future, which should begin to me necessarily here, because the country is still primarily agrarian and rural. And so that's why I feel like it is a different opportunity. Also to imagine the private, the corporate, the democratic, the entrepreneurial, the education, there's a philosophy of education in rural India. Agriculture teaches you in certain ways. To me, I would rename it and we try again and see how many people actually start with rural and agrarian. It would be a good test of whether we have shifted the discourse.
Thank you. So we have several questions that have come in both over Zoom and YouTube. So the first question is being asked by A. Shyam, who asks, traditional agriculture seems to be making its way back after the Green Revolution, which introduced pesticides in agriculture. Could modern technological developments facilitate a better agriculture, as everyone seems to be health conscious these days? He mentions organic farming in brackets.
I mean, absolutely. I think that is the way to go ahead. I mean, AI, you can think of, as completely urban and global, but you can use these technologies in agriculture as well. I mean, there is nothing called traditional agriculture. Agriculture was always dynamic. I think this whole framing also has a problem. But yes, now we don't want to use fertilizers. We don't want to use chemical pesticides. But these are also technological questions. To think of tradition as static when they were doing compost, that also was technology. Making compost out of your garbage is also technology. And how better you can kind of engage with your own resources, which does not give us poison, right? But if you have to import something from outside, that doesn't mean that rural should resist that. But as I think Mekhla is saying, they've always been political questions, right? How somebody wants to put a particular kind of technology into your system, and then you become completely helpless. I mean, we don't really know if we have not actually critically engaged with the reality of Green Revolution. Did it actually increase income? How much did it do? and did the country benefit from it? Because these were not empirical questions. So I think obviously talking about traditional village or agriculture does not mean going back to the village as it is imagined as traditional, right? It is always going forward. That's what I think Mekla was trying to say. How do we move forward without the kind of poisonous technology which has been given to us, which is also not sustainable, which is also not, good for farmers or for, even urban middle class people like us.
Yeah, I mean, just two things. I think to do better with technology, we actually need better state capacity. We need better we need better public science. We need better public regulation, because science and technology in agriculture is complicated, and many of the things that we consider modern or traditional both have toxicities of different kinds, both have opportunities of different kinds. But what we need is science in the public interest, right? And for that, it's actually incredibly tough because a lot of things are unknown still. So we need to have much greater capacity, and Indian science can do this, right? Like we have the capacity if we decentralize, if we build up agricultural universities, if we reinvigorate what extension should be all about, which is about dynamic knowledge management. Then you can, and again, I don't think it's traditional or modern, it'll just be agriculture for this moment and this time. Certainly, I think digital, everybody, when you talk about tech in agriculture, they assume agri-tech and they assume digital. But technology has a very old history in agriculture. Everything, the implements, the methods of plowing, the methods of harvest, the methods of storage, the bags in which things are stored, all of this has had technique. I think it's also really important to ask, there are many farmers in India today who actually never adopted pesticides and never adopted, so sometimes people call them default non-pesticide because the state never reached them. The Green Revolution never reached them in the way it was supposed to reach. Today, those farmers have a natural advantage in markets if we can actually connect them and get them, to the consumers who actually want non-pesticides. So I think there's lots of important and creative work happening here. But I think it's really important not to, again, become dogmatic and in these camps and assume that technology is traditional or modern and that we always had the answers.
Anisur Rahman Khan on YouTube asks, with the growing evidence of land loss due to industrialization or urbanization, what would be the likely consequences for rural areas in the subcontinent?
Go ahead, Matthew.
Do you want to start on that?
No, I was saying you can go ahead. Yeah, I can. I mean, these are context-specific questions. We can't really have a general answer to this. In some areas, farmers are very happy to move out if you give them decent compensation. In some areas, they don't want to do that. So one needs to kind of not fetishize the logic of industrialization, that industrialization is inevitable and it is desirable and anyone who stops it should be destroyed. And I think that kind of imagination is very dangerous. So you need to kind of see if there are areas where there's a lot of land lying unused. So, but industry will not go there because it would be a little more expensive there. So I think, how do we treat people as citizens? So those who are living there, if they don't want to give up their land, you move somewhere else. Why should you compel them? And I think that's where the problem lies. The problem is not that anybody is against industrialization, but one should not make fetish of industrialization. What will you get out of industrialization? Poisonous water. Some people will become very rich. So we need to keep human life in the center. And there is kind of global logic which everyone is bought into, which has turned out to be self-defeating in many ways.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think it's also exactly as you said, it's very, very context specific, and they're very, very different stories. In scheduled areas, the land has got a different dynamic. In places where you have larger landholders, where you have very small farms. So I think it's very difficult to talk in generic terms. What we have learned is that the price of agricultural land is certainly not easy to fix. And the meanings and purposes, the social and other meanings of land use,
land access are also very, very different. So, in agriculture, for example, land ownership and land use are different, right? So many people don't own, but actually access, so use rights. So these are much more complicated. And I think we would all do better to ask very, specific questions of particular places and particular times and particular kinds of relationships, while having this overall frame in place, because it's a diverse story.
Anup Kumar asks, in many parts of India, rural areas have seen growth in services such as education and health, with infrastructure development such as roads, electricity, and piped water. This has allowed many to improve their quality of life and has led to many families choosing the village for migration over migration to a town or a city. Even many who worked in the city all their lives have chosen to return to their village after retirement. I have seen this happening in Bihar and Uttarakhand. What is the state of sociological scholarship on this phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, there's no scholarship on this phenomenon, but I've also noticed when I was doing my fieldwork in Himachal Pradesh, lots of people came back to villages. So I think this in some sense reinforces the point that we are making, that, mobilities can also be circular. There's not like one single direction. People do want to come back to, I think, because they find life better there. And villages are not the villages that they left. These are different kinds of places, but they feel that they can still live a better life there. So one needs to kind of also, as we have again and again been saying, not to go into these binaries that there are cities and there are villages. There are villages within cities. There are urban-like lifestyles in the village. I mean, in many villages, you can have middle-class lifestyles and you'll have access to everything. Not only refrigerators and television, but also your kind of high-speed internet. So all that has become possible, which in some sense should motivate or motivates lots of people to kind of live in less crowded areas, and they have some agricultural land also, they have kinship. So these choices are made by individuals. So it can't be like Dalits may not want to live in villages because they don't really have places to live. They have tiny hutments, and if they come to cities, there's more anonymity. So it would again depend on, women may also not want to go back to the village. So it might be little kind of less kind of free for them. So all these things also, one should kind of keep it open rather than theorizing it as, going this direction or that direction.
I mean, I think as a policy question, I think keeping it open is the most important, because it is also about individual freedoms. And I think it's really important to think about life cycles, right? I mean, when urban people, all our parents, have retirement plans, we assume they have retirement plans, and that they may not retire necessarily where their children are, or maybe they will retire where their children are, depending on whether both their children work, and whether, we assume we are trying to understand this, but we don't think of this as sociologically interesting. But of course, it's deeply sociologically interesting. So to me, the question of where a person goes to retire or to live out their last lives, or chooses to work at the peak of their careers, right? Or whether you choose to move for your children's education. These are the questions of our times. And you'll only understand them in relationship to everything else. So I don't think it's peculiar that people from villages come back and then, go back. We don't think it's peculiar when our parents choose to settle near us, or, or some people are choosing homes and now others are. So I think these are the questions India is going to have to see, how we deal with aging, how we deal with young, where you want to live and die. And I think this is really something that we don't pay enough attention to, these sociological processes. And actually, I think age and life cycles are very important ways of thinking about different stages and how people organize themselves. So they're all choices.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Aditya Sharma asks, how do you look at the role of research in agricultural universities across India in the larger debate of rural futures?
Go ahead, Nicola.
Yeah, I think they're really important.
I think we have hollowed out agricultural universities. And, when we often think about in the US, we talk about the land grant universities, we talk about Cornell and all of these places, they actually grew on agriculture and on people taking agriculture really very seriously, and then growing the liberal arts around them, right? So agricultural universities should be places where conversations like we're having today have place along with science, along with economics, along with policy, along with sociology. They should not be seen as just purely technical places. They are part of living movements of managing knowledge, of in extension systems. So the problem is that we talk about I teach at Ashoka. We talk about liberal arts universities, right? To me, agricultural universities have always been, if they're done right, the heart of liberal arts education anywhere, arts and science, because liberal arts has always had science. So to me, I think the future of how we think about education needs to change. And I would say agricultural universities would have a vital role to play there, a role that connects the technical, the social, and the administrative. But we've always hollowed them out. We've seen them as purely technical. We haven't invested in them in the way that we should have. But if we have a vision for agriculture, as if it really matters, then I think the public education institutions for agriculture will be very important. So we talk about the Indian Institute of Science, we talk of TIFR, all with a lot of pride. Our agricultural universities should be of that caliber, and with pride, we talk about IITs and IIMs, but really these are the places where you learn and practice the best of art and science, I think, and social science. So I think they could have a very exciting future if we actually cared about them.
Just to add to kind of what Mekhla has just said, this is connected with what we were earlier talking about. What Mekhla was talking, why talk about rural futures? Why not talk about India's futures and then see rural or agrarian as perhaps the starting point of that? So I think why agricultural universities declined in India, even though they are still there, is because they are not India's futures. They're not seen as India's future. And who is deciding that? Who is doing that? I think this is not being done by professors working in agriculture universities. This is because priorities of the country as a whole have changed, and these are basically the new elite of India, whether they are politicians or they are urban middle class, otherwise people who matter, and they visualize India as a kind of United States, which it is never going to be, right? I mean, it's not something that we can ever achieve, or perhaps we ought to achieve, or we should even aspire to achieve. And that's where I think the point that I think Mekhla was making, that India could be an empirical window for visualizing the world differently, for visualizing these common senses of historical trajectories differently. And we already on ground have that process, and people are, when they come to Delhi, they don't settle, farmers don't settle as villagers. They set up townships. And if you had gone to these sites of protest, I've written on this in a paper that came out along with Mekhla in Journal of Peasant Studies, that these were townships of protest. Their imaginations include both rural and urban, agriculture and services, agriculture and global markets, and they are knowledgeable subjects. They know everything. So how do you kind of position all these people back in the center stage of what India is? In that sense, we need to kind of reimagine the very idea of India by making it kind of more democratic, is perhaps the best word to use.
Yeah. Great. Thank you all so much. That was, I know there were more questions than we were able to answer, but it's been a really wonderful evening, and thank you so much for giving us a chance to have this discussion.
Same here. I second everything that Mekhla said. Yes.
Professor Jodka, Dr. Krishnamurthy, thank you very much for that fascinating and very enjoyable discussion on a subject that is so relevant to our country. You have certainly given everyone a lot to ponder upon. I would also like to thank all members of our audience who joined us on Zoom, and those watching this discussion live on YouTube, for being with us this evening and for putting forward those interesting and nuanced questions. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you also to all colleagues at Orient Black Swan for your support and help in making today's event a success. Those who could not join us this evening can listen to the discussion on our YouTube channel, where all our previous discussions and webinars have been archived. Thank you all once again, and I wish everyone a very pleasant evening and weekend. Goodbye and good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.